coming tonight to the third installment of Carnegie Conversations. Through these discussions, we hope to contribute to discourse on important issues at the university and deepening mutual understanding and informed dialogue. Just a quick note to everyone that we are recording this event, so please find one of the Carnegie members if you have any questions about that. Tonight's guest has had an accomplished career in the private sector, currently acting as chairman to the Byblos Real Estate Development Company and executive chairman of Dime Holdings. He previously held the post of ambassador to Germany from 2017 to 2019 and is the current ambassador to the UK. He'll be speaking with two club members, Harry and Phoebe, and discussing a variety of topics addressing questions on Saudi's culture, domestic and foreign policies. We will then move to audience questions to advance the discussion from there. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Saudi ambassador to the UK, His Royal Highness Prince Khalid bin Bandar Al Saud.
Thank you for joining us, Ambassador.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I look forward to a lively discussion.
Me too. I think maybe a good place to start would be, you said that when you became the ambassador to the UK, your goal was to take the 40 years of facts about Saudi and correct them. 5 years down the line, what do you think is the most important fact you've corrected?
Well, that is a very good question. What a way to start. Thank you. I think the most important thing that I've begun to see changing when it comes to people's perceptions of Saudi Arabia is that there is a possibility that what they think may not be correct. And it's important because that begins to address all the other issues. If I go back to when I first arrived and before that, people were absolutely sure of their impression and opinion of Saudi Arabia, who its people were, what its culture was, and what it believed. Whereas today people are giving the country a chance. They're going to visit. They're asking the questions. They're curious about what's happening and what they're hearing. And part of that is it's in the papers a lot more. It's not necessarily my work that's doing this, but it's the curiosity which I think is important. And that starts the process and hopefully will carry on of its own accord without any work from me.
Yeah, as you said, we hear a lot about Saudi in the papers these days, and it can be quite hard for us who've never been to Saudi to make sense of it all. What does it mean to you to be Saudi?
So I come from Central Arabia, right in the middle. I was joking earlier, many people say it's the most backward part of Arabia because it's furthest from everyone else. But we had a discussion earlier of how Arabia has developed and its history and how divided the country has been. It's a tribal country, but beyond that it's also in the middle of 3 continents and has had influences from all over throughout history, pulling it in different directions. It is right in the cradle of civilization. And so there's a beautiful link to history that is very old. My father used to joke that the majority of the world's greatest prophets were sent to our region for a reason, is because we don't listen. But it's also because so much has happened in this small part of the world. And in Saudi, we've been on the periphery of it. We've seen it, we've been part of it, but we've also been out of it and on our own. And being part of, seeing that perspective of history is something that for us means a lot. We look at things over the course of 1,000 years, 2,000 years, and we remember what happened 5,000 years ago. All that affects our interaction with each other, and in some places you don't quite get that perspective on history. Some places much more short-term, particularly in the modern world with digital technology. For us, it's still important what happened many, many generations ago. I can go through my family lineage 17, 18 generations. Not because it's special to me. Most Saudis can do that because history is important to us. So, to be Saudi in the modern era is unique because we have that link to history, that link to much of what's happened in our part of the world, some of it good, some of it bad. But also, there's an energy about Saudi today which is forward-looking. It's energetic. It is ambitious. It's a can-do era. It's not asking why should we be doing things. It's asking why shouldn't we be doing things. And I think that is unique in my lifetime. And so it's a Saudi that's very exciting. It's not something that I've experienced before. It's a total shift in our country. But part of that is we're a young nation. I'm 46. I'm older than 80% of the country. Roughly 40% of Saudis are still in school. So there's a lot more to come. There's a drive and energy which is spectacular. So Saudi for me today, being Saudi, is all about wow, look where we're going. And it's quite cool to be part of that.
As you said, there's a great appreciation for history in Saudi Arabia. It seems to me that at times in the country's history, there's been a tension between conservative Islam and modernism. Do you think that this tension still exists today? And if so, how do you hope to solve it?
I mean, I think that's a natural tension that exists in any society, in any ideology, in any religion. There are always going to be different groups who think their way is the right way, and they'll pull at each other. I think part of the conservativeness of Arabia comes from the fact, and we were talking about this earlier, Arabia, its history is a harsh desert climate where survival was the only important thing. And so for 10,000 years, all of our society was focused on the communal survival, which meant the individual was irrelevant. You were prepared to sacrifice the individual to protect the community. Because if the community died, there's nothing left anyway, and the individual is therefore irrelevant. And this is a subconscious way of thinking. It is what colored the way we look at everything else in our history. And it's important to understand that, because if you don't understand that, you cannot possibly understand who we are and how we are where we are. And so the resistance to change, conservatism, all of that is tied into protecting the community. Focusing on what you know, not what you don't know. A very good friend of mine gave me a book about Saudi, which I arrogantly, when I was younger, thought, what am I going to learn from someone else's book about Saudi? And in it, the writer, who was an American writer, said something really interesting. He worked in Saudi for many years, and he said, the thing about Saudis that you have to understand is there are people of the desert, and they will walk along the desert with a great thirst. And at the very distance, they'll see water. But they're not sure if it's mirage or if it's a real oasis. And being clever and understanding the desert, they walk very slowly. Because if they ran and it's a mirage, they might die. So they walk and walk and walk and walk till they're sure it's water, and then they run like hell. For a long time, that mentality developed, but became, we didn't run until we were in the water. And at that stage, there's no running. Where we are today is we're running full pelt, because we're no longer a society that needs to survive. We've gotten beyond that, and we have a young generation that understands it's about the community, but it's also about the individual. And I think this is a unique element that we see in Saudi, modern Saudi Arabia, and it's really been spurred on by properly visionary leadership. People hear those kind of phrases and they go, oh, yeah, it's another phrase that a government official will say about their leadership. But I mean, I cannot tell you what a change and a breath of fresh air the leadership we have in Saudi Arabia today has brought. And part of that is because it's young leadership. You know, our Crown Prince is 10 years younger than me. He is from that generation that is changing. He is ambitious. He is looking forward. But again, in order to know where you're going, you've got to know where you're coming from. Otherwise, you have no bearing on direction. And without direction, all the energy in the world is useless. Energy without direction is an explosion. energy with a direction is a laser. And we are more laser than explosion, thank God. And we want to try and refine that even further so that we're picking very precisely the path that we're trying to go down.
Yeah, it's clear that Saudi's on a very progressive path at the moment. And in 2016, the Crown Prince announced a Vision 2030. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and the aims of the project?
Sure. Very simply, Vision 2030 is about quality of life. And again, that sounds vague in general, but improving the quality of life of people in Saudi. And that involves everything. It's totally holistic. It means that they need to have things to do, both in terms of job and entertainment and life, and have a fulfilling life. It means their environment needs to be comfortable and clean. It means that they have to have opportunities to work, to play, to grow. It means that they have to be healthy. So that involves not just healthcare, but it involves mental health. It involves all sorts of things. And once you start realizing how much is involved in that, you start thinking, there's no way I can achieve all these things. There's no way we can do enough to really improve quality of life. So you have two choices. You can either say, oh well, tough luck, let's just carry on the way we were. Or you can say, well, let's just start addressing these issues one by one. We will break them down. We will do what we can that's easy now. And we will work on what is difficult. But it takes time to change all those things. Basic statistic, we've changed over 3,000 laws and regulations in Saudi in 7 years. That's huge. And we're only about 30–40% of the way through it. It takes time to change. People say, well, why haven't you done this? We're getting there. Well, we can't do it all at once. And some of the changes you make, you realize, well, that didn't work so well, so let's try something else. So it's a learning process. There is no easy road. There is no Saudi Arabia before us that developed the way we want to develop. So we're learning as we go. Sure, other countries had their own development paths, but none of them is exactly the same as ours. So ours has to be ours. We cannot import someone else's development path onto Saudi because it doesn't work. Countries have tried that a number of times. It fails every time. You have to do it yourself. It has to be homegrown. It has to suit your people. It has to suit their desires, their wants, their needs. And we were talking earlier about what one thinks. One of the things that you're seeing in Saudi today, I've always believed that if you think your argument is correct, then you should be able to defend it. If you can't defend it, you're probably wrong. But part of wanting to defend it is to allow yourself to be challenged and therefore have someone else's argument put forward to you. That's not always easy, and sometimes you find, well, maybe I don't know how to defend it. But unless you're willing to take that risk, your idea, your thought, your perspective, your point of view will never improve. And if you don't want to improve, you're going nowhere. And Vision 2030 is about all of those things. But as you start realizing how big of a task that is, you start realizing it's not just about doing it in Saudi. It's about your neighbors and their neighbors. I mean, how do you affect, if we became a perfectly green, sustainable country in Saudi Arabia, it does nothing to affect climate change. Everyone needs to be green and perfectly sustainable. So you have to start working with everyone else on plenty of things. If we decide in Saudi that we will never ever have conflict again, that doesn't mean the people around you won't want to have conflict. So everything is about engagement, it's about partnership, it's about cooperation, it is about understanding what everyone else is doing and trying to participate with them, not cut them off. We live in a world where far too many people don't want to engage. And just because you don't like someone doesn't mean you shouldn't engage with them. You engage with them, you learn, you challenge, you try and improve the way they think, and they try and improve the way you think. And you know what? Together, you usually come up with a better solution for both of you. That is the mentality we're in. That is what Vision 2030 is in conceptual sense. In a practical sense, it's about all the targets that we're trying to hit, about improving the role of women in our labor force. It's about equal rights. It's about people playing more sport, therefore becoming more healthy. It's about improving our healthcare system, improving our education system, opening the country to other people, developing new industries, moving away from oil. All of these things go into creating that quality of life and a more improved way for people to get along every day in a basic sense.
One of the most eye-catching parts of Vision 2030 is the establishment of the region NEOM, which is supposed to help Saudi diversify away from oil. We've seen the plans for the futuristic city, the Line. Last month, it was reported by Bloomberg that the construction of the city is far behind schedule, and instead of stretching 170 kilometers, by 2030 it will only stretch 2.4 kilometers long, and that instead of housing 1.5 billion people, it will only house 300,000 people. Do you think that the initial aims of this project are feasible?
So, I mean, NEOM itself is much bigger than just the Line. There's different elements to NEOM. But the Line is certainly it's the big showcase feature of NEOM. It is exactly what I've just been saying. It's ambition. It is, we're going to try what is considered undoable. Kennedy wanted to get to the moon, but Kennedy died before the US got to the moon. It happened, but it happened a lot later than he would have liked. Some of these things don't happen along the schedule that you hope they will, but if you're not trying to hit your target in an ambitious sense, you certainly ain't going anywhere. Now, the Line itself, and again, this is where people sometimes don't read what we actually say, was never a project that was totally going to be finished by 2030. That's number one. Number two, we have realized the scale of the challenge of doing something that is, that ambitious. And I'll get to the Line in particular, why it's more interesting than people think it is. But we're still going ahead with it, and we're going to try and do as much as we can in that first phase by 2030 and put it out there as a proof of concept, not just a proof of concept of what some people consider a bonkers idea, but a proof of concept that in Saudi we can do what everyone said was impossible. In the past, we would have said, yeah, you're right, it's impossible. That's not the Saudi of today. The Saudi of today is, we're going to make it happen, we're going to find a way to do it. And though we may fail, it's that inspiration to everyone else in our country and around us to say, you've got to try. Britain is a great example of innovation and ambition. If you look around London, the majority of statues of people in London are not statues of people who succeeded. They're people who died trying to do something. And why was that revered? Because that was difficult. Once you've done it, it's no longer difficult, it's easy because it's been done. It is the challenge to yourself, your society, your people, your country. That's a mentality that we want. And in doing so, you do great things, you innovate, you move forward. Now the Line, as a concept, and people say, well, why are you trying to do something so crazy, building a whole city inside? Why would you do that? Well, if you've ever been to Riyadh in July, you will know that we spend all our time inside. You don't go outside. In certainly Northern Europe, but much of the world where you have winters, you want to start your car, you have to let it warm up, you have to de-ice the windows. In Saudi, we have to start our car and wait for it to cool down. It's so hot inside, I remember when I was younger, if you left a cassette tape, many of you probably haven't used the cassette tape, it melts if you leave it in your car. On the coastlines, it's so humid, if you wear glasses, you walk outside and they're fogged up for half an hour, and you can't use them. So it's a totally different way of living. If we keep going the way we are in terms of climate change in the world, Riyadh will be unlivable not just in July, but half the year. Now, if you cannot live outside for half the year, you might as well live all of it inside. This is the kind of idea that we're looking at. How do we deal with the world we might be living in, not the world we live in? There's no point building what we need now, because we're not going to need it when it's done. We want to be building and looking for what we will need in the future. And that's what the Line is about. It's about ambition and trying and pushing the limits of what is possible. And if people don't believe it, Well, when we're done with it, you can then judge us. But give us a chance.
I will be asking the ambassador about Saudi Arabia's response to climate change, as you've just discussed, and also, more recently, human rights reforms. It would be great for you to help us explore and understand your country's approaches to these topics. And if there's anything I leave out, I would be very grateful if you could add a bit more. So as you've just mentioned, climate scientists say that the Middle East temperatures are rising twice as fast as the global average. How serious do you think the climate crisis is, as opposed to other issues? And how serious is Saudi Arabia about moving away from oil towards renewable sources of energy, not just the line, for example?
I mean, you look around at the world we live in today, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or the United Kingdom or the US or China or Pakistan or South America, and you see, and some of it may be that we just have better access to knowledge, so we see more of things that are already happening. But there's no question climate is in a pretty funky place at the moment. I mean, anyone who saw pictures of the UAE and Dubai in particular over the weekend and the rainfall they've had, it's pretty unprecedented. I can tell you that the temperatures in Riyadh in the summer are really unbearable. And I remember in my lifetime when it wasn't like that. So it's a very serious issue. And anyone who tells you it's not is certainly not living in reality. Now, you want to talk about the reasons for, the why, the how, the where. I am not an expert on these things, nor a scientist. What I do know is that there is something happening. And if we don't do something about it and it keeps going in the direction it's going, much of the world will be unlivable. And, we get a lot of criticism in Saudi because we're an oil-producing nation, we don't care about the climate, and there are countries that will be underwater if the world keeps getting warmer. Well, guess what? We'll also be on the front line of countries that don't exist if the climate gets warmer. People forget about that. It's real for us. So we are taking it seriously, but when we try and do things that are innovative and new and diversifying, we get criticized for everything which works. You're clearly bonkers. Why are you doing that? Hang on a second. You want us to change, but when we try and change, it's crazy. It is crazy, but it's real. We had, as an example of targets that we're hitting and the direction we're going, 6 years ago, less than 0.1% of our energy came from renewable sources. Our target by 2030 is to hit 50%. That's a very short window from 2016 to 2030. Well, we've already opened 4 solar power plants, big ones, another 4 or 5 turbine plants. We've got another 6 plants, solar power plants being built. We have another 10 that are in design phase. If we build all of these, we will hit that target of 50% by 2030. These aren't subjects being discussed or debated in our government. They're projects that are being done. There are budgets being put aside for them. We wouldn't do this if we didn't. I mean, just the other day, and it's not my job to get involved in domestic issues, but I see projects here and in other countries that people have been talking about for 10 years. And they're still talking about trying to do them. And by the way, the project that they were talking about 10 years ago is now obsolete and doesn't have a place. We're doing them. And I would urge people to come and see the projects that we're building and then judge whether we're doing it seriously or not. But exactly like the line, we're trying to do something that is innovative, that is exciting for our young population. A place they might want to live, a place they might want to be part of, they want to be engineers to develop long-term projects, because we want to move away from oil. Now, does that mean we're going to shut off? We can't. We can't suddenly kill our economy. I was talking to, before COP26 in Glasgow, I was being lobbied heavily by someone to define our net zero goals moving forward. I said, look, we're working on it, but we're trying to find real, credible targets that we can hit, that we understand we can hit. because the commitments we make, we want to live up to. And these are long-term, in 50 years, our leadership, many of the people who are in leadership positions today will be in leadership positions in 2050, 2040. They don't want to lie. They don't want to say, this is where we're going, and then not do it, because they'll directly be criticized for the promise they made, versus other places where they make a promise, and they're not going to be around in 10, 15, 20 years. So they don't really mind what happens. They set the targets and hope that they're remembered well, but they don't have to implement them. So we are implementing the targets we set. No, but you must do A, B, C, D. We can't do A, B, C, D, because if we did A, B, C, D, our country would collapse. Our economy would collapse. And then you'd have 80% of our country, which is under the age of 35, with no hope, no future, no ambition. What do you think they're going to do? The system will collapse. And if the system collapses, what do you think will happen? There'll be a civil war. And if there's a civil war in Saudi Arabia, I guarantee you it ain't going to be local. Regions will get involved. The region gets involved, the rest of the world will get involved. And if the world gets involved, the emissions from a global war are going to be much worse than the emissions that you're complaining about right now. So it's your choice which you prefer. Now, I'm using quite an extreme example. The problem that we face quite often is that people want you to have a solution without thinking through the ramifications or the other options. What is the opportunity cost of taking a particular path? And what is the people rightly question, is it realistic for us to be able to build a city called the Line? But no one asks about, is it realistic for us to give up oil? It's not. So we have to find better solutions for it. We have to invest. Innovation and development and technology got us to the climate mess that we're in. It'll be innovation and technology and development, the human spirit, that'll get us out of the mess. Nobody wants to go back, and if we all went back and lived in the Stone Age, we'd dramatically improve the climate. But we dramatically upset the balance of humanity, which will just lead to people taking advantage and it getting worse, and so it's a failed option. But let's focus on the solution together, regardless of our differences. And right now, people want to focus on a solution, but they also want you to think like them. But I don't want to think like you. That doesn't mean we can't work on this solution together either. And I think until we figure out a way to balance that, we're going to struggle to move forward. But our view in Saudi is this is the direction we're moving. You're welcome to join us, or not. But we're definitely moving in a particular direction. And actually, more and more people are seeing that and thinking, look, there's positives here. Let's work on the positives. And the more positives you have, the more positives you develop, the more the negatives fall away. But, when there's so much positive, and you focus only on the little negative, it's a bit of a shame.
You've just spoken about the unlivable conditions of Riyadh, and obviously the benefits of the Line in that it being inside. But it has been estimated that the construction of it would produce 1.8 billion tons of embodied carbon dioxide emissions. For the audience, this is approximately equivalent to 4 years of the UK's emissions. Do you think the alleged sustainability of the Line outweighs the carbon cost of the construction? And do you know if there's a way that there's going to offset these emissions, for example?
Absolutely. Again, so this is part of the issue. One of the reasons the whole line would never have been built by 2030 is the targets and the goals that it's set for itself, the country, in building the line, means that we have to develop new ways of doing things. One of them is construction. What sort of concrete we use, where we source things, the type of equipment we use to build the line. All of that is being developed and being researched, and we're trying to figure out those solutions. So we're looking at building a plant in Saudi, again, building that will produce all of our construction equipment that is powered by electric engines rather than diesel engines. That's one effect. We're trying to develop technologies and work with companies and countries and researchers that are developing carbon-absorbing cement. we're trying to reuse materials from buildings that are being torn down in other parts of the country, so that you're not reintroducing a new form of carbon. All of these things are things that we're trying to figure out and work on. The intention, I'll give you an example of a non-shortcut that we're taking. Within the area that's called NEOM, there are enough minerals and oil and gas, if we sold them all, would pay for the building of the line. None of it is being touched because the whole region is protected. NEOM is partly an exercise in how can we do it better. In order to figure that out, we're going to have to figure out a lot of things that we don't have an answer to yet. But we're trying. And if we can figure it out, if we can do it better, it's not just going to benefit Saudi, it will benefit lots of other people. But it's a work in progress. So and it's right criticism for people to say, if you build this, the damage you're creating negates the building of it. I totally agree with that. But so do the people who are responsible for developing NEOM. They get that. And you're right, if we did it by the current standards, well, if we did anything by the current standards in NEOM, none of it would be built. So we want people to get involved. And if you have bright ideas, if you have solutions, come and share, come and join, we'll implement them. It's such an audacious, amazing opportunity for people to push the boundaries of what is possible. And other people are not doing that. You know, it wasn't easy to get to the moon. Bloody difficult. And it was so difficult that they stopped doing it. And they're only starting to do it again now. Why are they doing it again now? Because they think there may be some benefits. In mining, there may be some benefits. In other industries that develop from developing a moonshot ability, it's the same for us. Our moonshot ability is to be able to produce and do things in a way that nobody has thought of before. And we're opening up the country for people to come in and figure it out with us. But you can sit on the sidelines and say, it's impossible, it'll never happen. You know, ignore those people, they're throwing their money away. Or you can come and help us make it possible. Once upon a time, the Western world had that ambition. I don't know where that's gone. And I think, you know, hopefully we can help bring it back, because doing it together is a much better place.
Thank you. You've just listed some of the ways that Saudi Arabia are becoming more green and the efforts that they're taking. Prior to this talk, we spoke about how humans almost thrive off animosity. And do you think this is a reason why the UN is sort of deeming Saudi Arabia's actions towards climate change as critically insufficient? Absolutely, but if you read into the UN reports, almost every country in the world's attitude towards climate change is insufficient. Where some of the criticism comes towards Saudi Arabia is our position that in order to change and make things better, we need to use the resources that we have. It's very easy for the rest of the world to say, stop doing what you're doing. Fine, but will you pay for what's going to take its place? No, we won't. So what do you want us to do? We can't disappear, we can't, you know, if you're not going to be altruistic and charitable to us, help us do what we do better. And by the way, you know, we are trying to improve the ability of, you know, our fossil fuel industry to have, or to be less damaging to the climate. But we can only be responsible for what happens on our end. What people use with the product they buy is not our fault. Sure, we can stop selling it to them. But, you know, a lot of countries would struggle if we didn't have the income that we have. You know, what is spent, you look at the job opportunities that are created in Saudi Arabia that then lead to remittances in countries, not just in our region, but in the wider world. Those have a huge impact on those economies. If those economies struggle, you're adding to troubles in those countries. Those countries struggle. You know, without that income, without that prosperity, it's not going to help the climate. So we have two options. We can either look for solutions, or we can shut our eyes and say, don't do anything. Not doing something is not going to improve the situation. And, you know,
I always tell people I agree with something that Greta Thunberg said, and people say, "You agree with Greta Thunberg? How is that possible?" Greta Thunberg was stopped outside, I think it was COP26, maybe it was 27, and someone said to her, "Where's your solution?" She said, "My job is not to come up with a solution. That's their job inside. But I can tell you that they're wasting their time because they're not coming up with solutions, and my job is to tell everyone else, you need to find solutions." I agree with that. But rather than focus on what we're doing wrong, let's focus on improving what we're doing and finding solutions to it. Saudi Arabia's perspective and point of view on fossil fuels is, let's make it better. Because switching it off is only going to make everything worse. And rather than argue about whether it's good or bad, let's work together on making it better. We don't understand why that's a problem. Every country in the world has a different thing it can bring to the table. And it makes sense to me that we should all focus on what we can bring to the table rather than things we can't. And people seem to have an expectation of us that is much higher than what we can deliver. So there is unfair criticism coming from the right place. But people are not focusing on the solutions. And they're not focusing on, I'll give you an example, and this is, I mean, I was astounded when I heard this. When I was in Germany, I went to one of the pre-COP 23, 22, I can't remember which one it was, meetings. And I was there just as an observer, but listening to one of the German negotiators talk to one of the Saudi negotiators and said, "Look, we really want to focus on phasing out fossil fuels, and particularly oil. So we'd like you to make a commitment to phasing out oil." And so our negotiator said, "Well, that's fine, but we want you to phase out coal, because coal is much worse than oil." And the German negotiator said, "But coal is really important to our economy." You know, if that's the place you're starting your argument, that is selfish. Your economy is important. Despite what you're producing and using is much worse than what we're producing and using, our economy is irrelevant. You know, that is not the way to have a discussion to move things forward. So, you know, it's a complicated world, but I said earlier, one of the things I learned when I was younger in the military is if there's a problem, there's a solution. If there's no solution, there's no problem. And far too many people now have reversed that, and they say, we don't have a problem or a solution, and so we might as well forget about everything else. That's not very practical or useful. Let's focus on solutions. And where we don't have solutions, it's not that there isn't a problem, it's a reality we have to live with. And unless you can improve that reality, focus on the solutions elsewhere, but don't focus on the ones we can't solve. There's plenty we can do, and we don't spend enough time doing what we can, rather worrying about what we can't. And I think it's just counterproductive.
Something the country definitely can do is that the lifting of the ban on women driving, and this being a positive step. What are your country's further commitments to reform for women? And this is a sort of two-pronged question. In regards to this, how do the general public of Saudi Arabia see these reforms? As you were just saying, it wasn't necessarily something that was welcomed by both men and women.
All countries go through their own development process, that path I was talking about earlier. And people and cultures have a different perspective and outlook on things because of their history, where they are, myriad of things that happen around them that lead them to think, behave, and deal with and interact with the world in a different way. One can assume or decide that certain things are right and wrong, or you can say, there's right for me, there's wrong for you. I mean, we live in a world where everyone has a different truth, which I find crazy. You know, truth is what it is, but there are different perspectives. Perspective is important, and people are on a different development path. You cannot ask a 80-year-old human being to think like an 8-year-old, who thinks like an 18-year-old, who thinks like a 38-year-old. They all have had different experiences, just time-wise, let alone real-life experiences in different places. Those are different perspectives. where we are and what our people think, what they want for themselves, what are their priorities, is unique to Saudi Arabia. Women driving is a very good example. I have never understood why there was a problem with women driving, but I knew a lot of people who did have a big problem with it. That's a very different perspective. It's a different way of thinking. And if there are more people who think women shouldn't drive, who am I to say no? Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But either way, forcing a way of thinking on someone else very rarely produces the intended result. Most people react against that. So part of any change is about co-opting and bringing people along with you. And some things just require time. Is it any more right today for women in Britain to have the vote than it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago? It was probably just as right 200 years ago, but 200 years ago people would have told you you're crazy. 300 years ago, you're crazy. So at the right time, when the right number of things happen, people begin to change their mind, people begin to think differently, people begin to have different opinions. It's not always right for me, and it's not always right for you. Things are different. But unless you bring people along with you, and unless people genuinely want to go in a particular direction, it's very difficult to make it happen. You know, in 2018, when women were given the right to drive in Saudi, there were a lot of people who thought the country was going to, collapse. Because they had never, thought about what might happen. And within a few months, the country didn't disappear. Society didn't collapse. Things kept moving forward. In fact, many people's lives improved as a result. And once one unchangeable changes, it starts opening people's mind to, hang on, if that I thought was totally wrong, but it's happened, and it had benefits, what else did I think is totally wrong that may actually also have benefits? People begin to question, people begin to analyze, they begin to challenge their perspective. That is how you bring about change, not by saying, this is what you're going to do, because people talk about oppressive societies. That's just because the change is positive. It's still oppressive. And people react to oppression, not the result of the oppression. Communism in the Soviet Union, the concept was beautiful. Having everyone live peacefully, having everyone share everything, having all resources shared by... That's a beautiful idea. Where did it lead? Not a positive place. And millions of people died and were killed in trying to achieve a beautiful idea. Sometimes you have to remember we live in the real world, not an academic thought process. The beauty of academia is it's a place for people to challenge ideas, to find new ways, to test things out. And the idea may be brilliant, but is it practical? Not always. But you know what? We should keep challenging, keep finding better solutions, keep finding better ways to do it. But we also have to live in the real world that we actually live in. And quite often, we in Saudi are on the receiving end of what people want as perfection. But perfection is unachievable. And people expect more perfection from us. Not than we are prepared to give, but than they expect from themselves. And I think that's where we find it difficult and where we struggle. And sometimes asking too much of someone produces an unintended result, is them refusing and saying, nope, not interested, thank you very much. So, you look at a young person who's trying to do something and failing. Do you smack them on the head and say, that's wrong, do it better? Or do you encourage them? You say, well done for getting as far as you have. We don't get very many well dones in Saudi for what we've done. And if you look at the development of Saudi Arabia over 100 years, by and large, it's more positive every year. And it's more positive for its people. Ask the people of Saudi, don't ask me. Some won't like everything, some will like everything. There are some people who don't want certain things to happen, others who do. That's the same anywhere. All you have to listen to is your news coverage here of what's happening in your own country. How many people are furious with a decision the government has made? And they're absolutely wrong. Well, why is it okay for you to have people who say things are wrong but not for us? It's the same everywhere. But by and large, where things are going in Saudi Arabia is widely accepted. The changes are bedding in, they're becoming a normal way of life. That is why there's so much energy. That's why the country wouldn't be growing economically if things weren't going well. And it's one of the fastest growing economies in the G20. Now, people might say, so is China, but then is China developing totally poorly? That country has brought more people out of poverty than any other country in human history. So despite many things bad that you may disagree with, there's a lot of good. Focus on the good and try and weed out the bad. But if you only focus on the bad, the people doing good will turn around and say, well, what's the point? If I don't get any credit for what I'm achieving and what I'm doing, I might as well do nothing, because this is all people are worried about. Explain, change, improve, but also reward, engage, understand. There are certain things in Saudi Arabia that you're just not going to agree with from a certain perspective. That's fine, you don't have to. But the people there want to. I get all the time, I hear the argument, you need to be democratic. Well, the definition of democracy is doing what the majority of people want. If you're doing what the majority of people want, that's great, but until you disagree with it. And that's why there's a difference between a democracy and a republic, for instance. Republics are not about doing what the people want. It's about choosing representatives to do what is best for the people. That's an interesting system. So people get carried away with concepts without really thinking through what it means to try and implement those concepts. There are plenty of places in the world where people say, that's awful. Yeah, but they were elected. Does that make it right or wrong? Philosophical questions, maybe for debate at a later stage.
You've just expressed the importance of challenge, and I think you suggested that Saudi Arabia has become a more inclusive place for women, and that being beneficial. Sort of to end my conversation, I want to ask you if you think that Saudi Arabia will ever be a welcoming place towards LGBTQ plus people, and if you think this is something that needs to be challenged within the country.
My personal view, and this is my personal views, everything should always be challenged. When it will be a time that is more widely accepted is a good question. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. In the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, never. All of that is possible. By and large, again, you go back 150 years in this country and what was acceptable. Not even 150, 50 years ago, things that were acceptable or not acceptable. Things change, but it has to come from a desire of people to be accepting of certain things. And if people are not accepting of certain things, sure, there's a balance, there's a line of when you insist people do things and when you insist they don't do things, and when you allow things and when you don't allow things. It's difficult. And some of it is tied, again, in history in a way that people don't see or understand. So there was a selfishness attached to the concept of homosexuality in Arabia that predates Islam or religions. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. The community is important. In a harsh climate where survival of the tribe is important, the requirement on every member of that tribe is to be productive, to add, and to ensure the survival of the tribe going forward. If you chose not to have children, or chose your happiness over everyone else's, that was considered selfish and wasteful, and you were shunned. That subconscious mentality of interaction amongst people is where a lot of this comes from. Now, you can ask what I think about a particular issue. Because of my role, I try not to have a personal opinion. It's not very easy. But you have to understand where things come from and why people hold the strong views that they have. The right and wrong is irrelevant. The reality is the way people think. And if you want to change their point of view, you need to not tell them you're wrong, change it. Explain why you're wrong. If your argument is good enough, you will change their mind. if you don't make the argument, you're not going to get close to changing someone's mind. So the world we live in, where people are instructed on how to think, is not useful or practical. In fact, it engenders the opposite response from people. If I'm told what to do, I'm stubborn. I'm going to say no. I hate being told what to do, regardless of whether it's in my interest or not. And you see that throughout society, time and time and time and time and time again. Why should it be any different with us? People have a strong perspective and a strong point of view and a strong argument. Come and make it to me. Explain to me why. And don't stop with me. Explain it to the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person. And if you can't explain it to them, your argument is faulty or not good enough. So improve it. And if you try unbelievably hard and it's still not working, examine your argument. Maybe my argument is wrong. Maybe my perspective or position is wrong. That is how you change and improve things. You don't change them by insisting people do things. It's just, that's human nature. And so in Saudi Arabia, or any other country, it's not the only other country in the world that has a particular perspective on things. Plenty of countries do. Work with us. Your point of view is something that you hold dear and important. If it's so important, then work hard to try and change it. Don't just assume that people are going to jump on your bandwagon, because they won't. And sometimes, even working hard at it is not enough. Some things take time. You know, the amount of times I have 2 children, the amount of times I look at them and I ask them to do something, and they reject my ideas or concepts or suggestions, and I think to myself, how on earth am I going to convince them that I'm right? Because I remember when my parents told me exactly the same thing, and my thought process was, you have no idea what you're talking about. It's a tough thing to do, because you know. You have 2 choices. You can either wait, let them develop a little bit more, you can argue with them. I mean, if you really want, you can throw them into a closet, but that's not very practical, nor useful, nor very nice for their future. But that's what happens to Saudi. People say, don't like the way you think, get out of here, go into that closet, shut the door on you. That's not useful. That's not how you treat people. You treat people better by helping them develop, evolve, and change. Now, if you're not going to do that, then the topic that you're trying to change is probably not that important to you. But people say it is. Well, put that on the line. Show me how important it is to you by engaging. And if you're not prepared to engage, well...
More welcoming for gay people.
Well, again, it's different in different places. How you begin to make these changes, whether they're right, whether they're wrong, I don't know. I mean, my personal view is that people should make their own choices, and it's God that judges them. I'm a religious person, I believe in God, not me. But it's not easy. The steps you take, again, not easy. It wasn't easy here. There were heroes that were Alan Turing, very good example. People that were treated one way one day and then totally different another day. In many cases, too late. It's a difficult subject, it's a difficult issue. But again, hysteria does not improve anything. And engagement and discussion, does it mean that some people are going to be left behind? And it's not just with LGBTQ issues, all sorts of issues. Lines are drawn, and people just on the other side of a line are left behind. Is that fair? There is no moving line. That's just the way of life. People will be left behind in every society, on every issue, in every sense. It happens here in the United States. Find me one perfect country that has done everything and taken care of every member of its population. It doesn't happen. That doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to make sure that everybody on Earth has a perfect life. But I just don't know how we get there. It's never happened in history, and there are over 10,000 years of well-recorded human history. I haven't seen a single society that's done it properly. Athenian democracy. had slavery, women in Athens weren't treated particularly well. So, you know, you can pick and choose different elements of different societies at different times that are idealized. Great, but the rest of it is awful. That's no different today. There are things in Saudi that are really incredible and amazing. And there are things that you may disagree with, and may think that are awful. That doesn't change the fact that there are some positives there. There are plenty of ideal, wonderful democracies in this world. And there are ideal monarchies in this world. And there are corrupt democracies in this world, and there are corrupt monarchies in this world. That's just the way of things. The one thing to remember is that by and large, none of it is perfect. And as long as we're continuously striving to improve where we're going and to look after people, like I said, the quality of life issue that's central to Vision 2030, that is the most important thing. But not everyone is going to, unfortunately, be served perfectly. We have to be realistic. It's just not going to happen. We're just going to have to keep trying, keep working at it. And by the way, the more of us working together at any one thing, the more likely it's going to work. The more we cut each other off and stop engaging with each other, the less likely we're going to achieve it. And there's too much of the desire to cut people off rather than work with people. And that's really the thing that I'm trying to get at most. It's not about the right and wrong, it's about working together to improve everyone's lot. That cannot be a bad thing.
Let's talk a little bit about Saudi's foreign policy. Over the last 6 months, we've seen the war between Israel and Hamas, and now we're seeing escalation between Israel and Iran. How have the recent events affected Saudi's foreign policy?
Recent events haven't affected our foreign policy per se, but they've certainly made us focus more on trying to get to a more positive situation. Again, you look at our region, we've been doing conflict for 10,000 years. We're pretty good at it. But also, the reasons for conflict go back a long way. I mean, people look at Saudi and say, oh, you guys are a 100-year-old country. But the civilizations that have been interacting with each other have been doing so for a very long time, with recorded history that we know where we had arguments 7,000 years ago. And so they're important to today. There are other parts of the world that have no less length in their history, but much of that history is lost. And so it's not relevant to the problems of today. Our problems are very well recorded for a long time. And that makes them all the more complicated. And it makes it much easier for someone to say, I did this to you because of. Yeah, but I did it back to you because of. And you can keep going that because of for a long way. And at some stage, you've got to just throw that out the window and say, enough of the because ofs, but we need to get along with each other now. So, where we are in terms of the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict is probably the most dangerous it's ever been, in my opinion, because the possibility of it drawing not just regional powers into the issue, but the whole international system into the issue, I think is quite high. And far too many people are trying to use the conflict, not necessarily in a malicious way to further their own ends, but to further their own feeling of themselves, to make themselves feel better by saying, I support this, or I support that, or I'm on this side, or that's fair, or that's unfair. And forgetting the damage that might be caused, because whether you're Israeli or Palestinian and you hold a particular view, if both of you are dead, it's irrelevant. And if this conflict goes up 1 or 2 notches, there will be a lot of people, a lot more people dead than are today, and it's going to be much wider than just our region. So we have to work a lot harder on finding a solution and having the perspective of the other side, on both sides. It's not about one side or the other, because if you're only thinking about your perspective, you're not going to get the solution and you're not going to find the right solution. When all sides in a conflict realize they've all lost, that's usually when you find a solution. Problem is when both sides think they're still winning, or they are going to win. It's difficult to stop that. So for us, we have a renewed focus on trying to find a solution, and one that takes into account everybody's opinion. Again, not just the Israelis and the Palestinians, but the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, us, the Turks, the Arabians, the Americans, Muslims, Jews, Christians, all of it. All of those perspectives are important to deal with this. And that's why another issue that people forget about when it comes to this, and why this is such it's an important conflict for all of us to focus on, and why it is not like other conflicts. Because as sad as it is to say, there are places around the world where horrible things are happening. Many of them. But they do not affect other people. An oppressed people in one place, or kidnapped people in one place, as awful as it is, none of that's going to affect anyone's life in London, or in New York, or in Paris. What happens in the Middle East, in particular between the Israelis and the Palestinians, affects everyone, not just emotionally, but physically, because the possibility of this spreading. So it is a conflict unlike many others, which makes it much more important for us to be cautious, but firm, to be fair, and to pay attention to finding a solution that works for everyone. It is too important, and the disaster that may come out of this not being looked after properly is, it doesn't bear thinking. And there are far too many people on all sides, it's not one side or the other, who are far too focused on their own little issue. As awful as that sounds, you've got to be focused on everything. It's something that I've said about the Israeli government, for instance, is yes, they have every right to defend themselves, but not every right to be stupid. And that applies to the Palestinians as well. They have every right to demand a future for themselves in a region that they come from, but not a right to be stupid. Because, and it's sad to say for them each, their positions affect many more people outside their own groups. And that's an unfair responsibility for two nations to hold, but that's the reality of the world that we live in. It's not their fault, but that's where we are. And they have to step above their personal positions and think the responsibility they have for the world at large. Because a world war today is, every time there's a world war, the scale of death and destruction is worse than the last one. And the last World War was pretty bad. So where we end up next is not somewhere we want to even contemplate. So it's time to look beyond our own noses and find the solutions. That's the best I can say about where our thinking is. We need a solution that works for everyone. Otherwise, there is no Vision 2030. There is no world peace. There's no point having a UN for a world that doesn't exist anymore. Climate change, forget about it. It'll be way beyond the opportunity to fix it. And that's the level that this conflict is at, unfortunately. So it's important. And we need to be focused more on the solutions again than the problems. But all we're talking about is the problems. And it's not that this is nice. It's not that this is easy. And it's not that this is fair. It's not fair. It's not nice. It's not wonderful. But that's where we are. And we can focus on where we are, or we can focus on, a dream world where we'd like to be.
Thank you for your time, Ambassador. Now we'll open